right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar on college admissions testing. We're going to take about a minute and fill up the room. We're still letting folks in here, and we'll start within about a minute. But I'm your host, Jed Applerouth. Very happy to be here tonight talking to you guys about college admissions and our assessments, the SAT and the ACT. And other things too. We can expand the discussion with Q&A to include other things you want to ask about in terms of the world of admissions. But we're going to give people about another 30 seconds. I still see some people coming into the room. And then we'll go ahead and get started. Once we have a quorum, hope everyone's having a good Tuesday, wherever you are. Okay. Another few seconds here. A few more folks coming in. All right. So let me just tee off tonight's conversation. We're talking about testing. I have a comprehensive deck. I'm going to be answering a lot of questions that you might have, and hopefully by the end I'll have answered many of the questions you came with tonight. Then we'll have an open Q&A, and then we are going to be recording this. And so we are going to be sharing a copy of this with you within a day or so. We'll send you a link once we save the file and send it out your way. So additionally, we always do a little tiny poll at the beginning and a little one at the end. Let's go ahead and launch that one right now. It's simply two questions. The poll asks who you are. Are you an educator? Are you a parent? Do you have a student? So you can go ahead and answer the poll. That'll be launched within a few seconds, I believe. Or if not, it's not a big deal. There we go. So just parent, student, educator, and if so, what grade are you in? Boom, boom, very fast. And we'll have one final one at the end. Very, very short and sweet, very simple. Give us a sense of who you are. And at the end, if you want any kind of follow-up from us, any kind of support, that may be helpful to you. So without further ado, let's do this. Let's jump in and start fielding questions. And let me just do a quick video reset there for myself. Sometimes my camera gets a little fudgy. All right, let's do it. So the overarching high level with the college admissions testing is that we are in a world that is largely, predominantly, I would say overwhelmingly test optional, but test scores are creeping back. They are returning to schools that are highly selective. We're seeing test return requirements, and we're also seeing, even where it's optional, where they're still quite meaningful. And so, but even when colleges don't require assessments, they can have a meaningful impact on admissions decisions and merit-based scholarships and honors colleges and so forth. So test scores, even though they aren't required, doesn't mean they're not impactful. That's an important distinction. The high level, we have two tests, and you can see that the pandemic test took a real dive in 2021. There was a real decline, but things have been recovering. But look how much more the SAT has been recovering than the ACT. And that's the reason we have this brand new modified ACT, because they were really flatlining, and the College Board's been innovating. They brought a new test to market in 2024. Actually, it was October 2023 for the PSAT, and it's been a success. And they felt they had to counter. And one of the nice things about the new SAT, it's only 2 hours and 14 minutes long. I've been in this industry for 25 years. The SAT with the essay of old was a 5-hour test. So getting it down to 2 hours and 24 minutes with that 10-minute break is amazing. It's half the duration of the old test. So that's really a boon, and it's much easier to administer these tests during the school day, which is one of the main reasons that drove that change, and also one of the main reasons why the ACT just lopped off about an hour of content too, if you exclude the science section, which is now a 2-hour and 5-minute test without science. So that's very meaningful, and it's going to get more of these administered during the school day. That takes up 2 periods, not a whole day. So very impactful. So test return. Tests are back at many of the places that kids want to go. The schools that are most selective in the country are the ones where test return is coming back with force. And as well as the big flagship state schools. Most recently, Auburn just jumped back in the past month, and Ohio State, UT Austin, all the the Big Eight schools in Georgia, all the Florida schools, the Tennessee system. So, and I expect that over time we're going to see more and more flagships fill in. I'm looking to Alabama. I'm looking to any state school where they're very selective out of state. UNC. I'm looking at the UNC campus, potentially UVA, Alabama, things like schools like that. They're much more likely. So at Chapel Hill, they could be this year or the next year. We'll see when they go. And the calendar, we're not expecting any big changes until after this admission cycle. Like last year, Johns Hopkins announced in August. Then there was a pause until January. That's when the University of Miami required. Then Penn was February, Ohio State, Carnegie Mellon, Auburn. So, but again, if we see there was a big pop that happened in 2024 where a bunch of these schools, they were responding to research that came out of Harvard. There's a genius economist, Raj Chetty. You may know his work. He's a big data guy, analyzing data sets. He analyzed about like 1.5, 2 million applications to the Ivies Plus over many, many years, looking at the correlations and factors which predict success. And that research fueled what happened first at Dartmouth, then Yale, then Brown, then Harvard, then Cornell, Stanford. This was all based on the Harvard research. And if you're curious about what school might be next in terms of who might start requiring assessments, one of the best things to do is look at something called the Common Data Set, CDS. Type in any school in the country and type in the words Common Data Set. And it'll give you an option like, range of dates. The schools have to report this if they receive federal funding. And so it's, so if I search on University of Virginia, Common Data Set, that's where I pulled this. And if you go down to the C category, which is applicants, and then under testing, it's like C9, it'll show you this data. What percent of the students enrolled has submitted an SAT? What percent submitted an ACT? So, and that tells you, and whenever schools are around 70%, there's a decent likelihood they're going to go back test required. That's telling you that the admissions office seems to have a preference for assessments, which is why Princeton, I'm just waiting for any minute. After all their peer schools went test required, Princeton probably will too, because only 23% of students who are enrolled at Princeton didn't send test scores. So you can clearly see that test scores matter at Princeton and Chicago and Penn and Emory and other schools. Because there are schools that are very selective, like Vanderbilt, where this number is much lower, where they're not putting the same weight on assessments. So, but when admissions offices are showing you this data, they're giving you a hint that testing does matter to the school. The rationale, MIT came out in 2022, and they were very clear that without testing, we can't predict who will do well. Over Brown, that test scores are a better predictor here at Brown than our grades. Over Yale, test scores are the single best predictor we have of who will do well at Yale academically. And then with, and the high school GPA explains less than testing. So all this came out of that Opportunity Insights research that was spearheaded by Raj Chetty. And this is the graph that really is the essence, kind of the keystone about the study, that as I move up the chain with testing, these are the Ivy Plus schools, the Ivies Plus, it's going to be Stanford, it's going to be MIT, it's going to be Duke and Chicago, that if I have a 1200 SAT, my GPA at these schools is going to be around a 3.2. If I have a perfect score on the ST, I'm going to get probably closer to a 3.65. That's a meaningful spread. However, with high school grades, look how little it matters. If I have a high school GPA of 3.1, I'm going to end up with around a 3.45 GPA in college at these top schools. And if I have a 4.0, I'm going to end up with around a 3.54. So it's less than a point, 0.1 of a point. It's a fraction of a tenth of a GPA point going from a 3.1 to a 4. So high school grades, there's been a lot of compression and everyone's getting the same grades. So with all grade inflation, we've weakened the strength of high school grades to signal who's ready for college, which is one of the reasons why all these schools are going back test required, which is why we're going to see more of this over time, that the move back towards testing is not done. And one of the main problems in America is grade inflation. Too many kids having the same grades, which makes them less helpful as a predictor of performance in college. UT Austin, they came out with their research that the kids who did not submit test scores were much more likely to be on probation academically under a 2.0. And also the kicker was here at mid-year, freshman year, the test submitters had 0.86 grade points higher than those who didn't submit test scores. That's the same. That's like having a 3.5 GPA for test submitters versus having a 2.64 for non-submitters, which is very profound. That's a major difference, which is why UT Austin said test required everybody. And then after that, Auburn and Ohio State. And there are more flagship state schools coming because Texas isn't that special. If they saw this finding, why wouldn't other schools? So this to me is the essence of what's happening with why we're seeing a return to testing. It's this data. It's very powerful. John Ladding over at Emory down the street from where I live, he made it clear we aren't as trusting of grades these days. Grades are definitely inflated and not tied to performance like they used to be. Therefore, we're weighing other assessments like AP scores and also SATs and ACT scores. So Emory, if they go back test required, I wouldn't be surprised in the least. So we know that testing influences things even when schools are test optional. Strong scores can show readiness for academic work, and especially when it comes to STEM-oriented majors. Engineering, that math score matters. If you're like, finance, business, for calculus and derivatives and the math score matters quite a bit. And as well, that test scores can directly affect merit-based aid. Alabama has always been very generous with their merit-based aid. And many schools are trying to, recruit students, strong students. They want to build a good network of kids and become good alums who give back to the school. And so strong testers, they end up being good alums. So my niece, Ella, she's a senior this year at USC, but she applied to Alabama and she had a 1390 on the SAT, which made her eligible for that UA scholarship program. And the UA Scholar tuition out of state is $33,000. But if I get this merit-based award, I'm saving $24,000 a year. So my tuition drops down to $8,300, which is lower than in-state tuition based on my test score and having a 3.5 GPA. So Alabama and other schools like it in the South and Mississippi, and there's the Bright Futures program in Florida, where testing really makes a difference and informs merit-based awards. So should my kids still prioritize testing given the fact that the majority of schools in the country are test optional? Well, test optional doesn't mean test irrelevant. There are many things that are optional but still impactful. Having leadership, having strong courses, these are all options, but they make a difference. So not required, but still impactful. Now, there's also a question of, is there an advantage? And we have some data that began being available in 2021, 2022, and then schools locked up and they stopped sharing this data. But for a couple of years in the early pandemic, when this was all so new, colleges were sharing data about the number of kids they let in with scores and without scores, now black box. But like Yale came out and they were admitting kids 3-1. So test scores really mattered for Yale, which is why they're test required again. Boston College said they were test optional, doesn't matter, submit, not submit. But kids getting in with test scores, 29%, without scores, 11%. Clearly, and they've now changed their language. But for several years, it seemed like they were agnostic, and in fact, they weren't. And Colgate, 2-1, Notre Dame, Emory, 2-1, UVA, 2-1, Wellesley. But then there are schools like Vandy, again, where there's a much lower difference. The admit rate with and without tests is about the same, very different than schools like Emory, Notre Dame, Yale, and Boston College. So that's one thing. You can look at their language, and that'll help you. Like Grinnell says, hey, if you don't submit a score, we have less information. It might help you, which means unless there is really unusual circumstances, they want to see test scores. Boston College, for this reason, students who complete their testing are encouraged. You see the word encouraged? That tends to mean we want to see it. And again, you see their rates of admission with test scores are 3-1 without. So they're being very clear. Tufts is getting more transparent with what they want. And this is a good thing. Like my niece, Ella, again, she scored a 1390, and the Tulane rep came to her school and said, if you don't have a 1420, don't send your scores. 1390, keep them to yourself. And she did, and she applied and got in. So listen to them when they tell you what they want. And Tufts says, hey, if you have a 13 or above, send it. Even if the average for Tufts is closer to 1450 or so, they're telling you they'd rather you send a 1310 than withhold scores, and then they have no clue whether you got 1,000 or whatever you got. So, but 1300 plus helps you in the process. So listen to them when they share this kind of data. On Auburn is very interesting. Auburn had a policy where they were conditional test optional, that under a 3.6, you require to send test scores. Above a 3.6, it was optional. But now they're being clear, hey, that the pipeline of kids getting in without test scores is small. And they're saying for this year, less than 5% of kids will be getting in without test scores. So they're test optional, but they're telling you not really at all. And then next year, in the fall of 2027, you have to submit a test score. So they're being very transparent that we want test scores and we're about to require them. So Auburn went from test optional to test conditional to test required. And this is a path that we're seeing. And the schools like Caltech, they went test blind to test required. So we're seeing interesting movements as the pandemic gets further and further in the rearview mirror. So more and more kids are choosing to send their test scores with strategy. Like my niece got a 39. She got a 1390. So she sent that to Georgia, got in, sent that to South Carolina, got in, withheld that from Tulane, got in, sent it to UVA, but didn't get in there. They're pretty tough. But she sent it to 4 schools and withheld it 4 schools. And that's very common, where more and more students are submitting, the same test score will help you here and hurt you here. So you have to look at those middle 50 percentiles and determine, is my score competitive or not? Am I in the range? Am I in the top half? If in top half, you send it. If you're below the top half by a little bit, you think about it. If you're in the bottom quarter, typically you withhold it because it's not going to strengthen if you're in the lower quartile of students. For non-first-gen students, we see for the first time since the pandemic that more kids are reporting scores than withholding scores. These are kids who are not first-generation students. So, and we expect, again, as you get Texas being test required, Ohio State, Auburn, we're going to see more and more kids sending test scores and fewer withholding, at least from some schools. They may withhold from some, but most everyone's going to be having a test score. And some of the schools on their list will typically be required as that list keeps growing. All right, and for certain kinds of kids, test scores matter more. Engineers, business majors with finance and calculus and derivatives, STEM kids, and it's all about math. It isn't about that science subscore, which no one really cares about. It's about the math score, because if you can't do the algebra 2 and the geometry and the algebra, you can have a hard time probably with differential equations and advanced calculus. So they're using math as a proxy for academic readiness. That's why they want those test scores. That's why MIT and Carnegie Mellon and Caltech, they're all test required. And I wrote an article back in August. If you get a newsletter, you probably saw this, why engineering program applicants can't count on test optional. And we show that of the top 16 schools, now we have more and more going test required, MIT, Georgia Tech, Purdue, Stanford, because again, it's that math. And even Cooper Union said they're test required for the engineers. All the military academies test required for, now Worcester Polytechnic made a big move when they said we're going test blind. Within a couple of years, boom, they're back to optional because testing can help them predict who will do well in these programs. So testing typically has more weight at schools that are very selective. That's the privates and the big public flagships. And when you have very selective admissions for out-of-state kids or for public schools, there's a good chance they're going to move in a couple of years toward test required. All right, so that's the broad landscape. Let me do a deeper dive into the assessments and talk about some of the nuances there. So we have the ACT and the SAT. In April, the enhanced ACT arrived in digital format, and in September in paper format. So now every ACT is in the same format. You have reading, English, and math, then an optional science, which a lot of our kids aren't taking science now, though we recommend everyone take it one time. And the SAT is simply, you have 2 modules, your baseline module, which everyone gets a similar module. And then if I get more than 2/3 right, I go to a harder adaptive module. If I get less than 2/3 right, I go to an easier module. And then 10-minute break, and then math. Similar baseline, which is a smattering of easy, medium, hard. If I get more than 2/3 right, I go to a hard module. Less than 2/3 right, I go to an easier module. That's the general heuristic there. Now, both of them have changed quite a bit. The SAT was redesigned it was delivered in March of 2024, and now the ACT was just thoroughly redesigned, and it arrived in April digitally and last month on paper. And they're gonna, right now, there's still a concordance table, which is gonna hold, and they're gonna do a new concordance in about 1.5 years, and that'll be coming out in 2027. All right, so again, I mentioned this is the structure of the SAT, baseline, and you go easier, hard, adaptive. And the ACT is now here in its shorter linear form. So the ACT, even digitally, it's not adaptive. The SAT is much more efficient, and they can do it in fewer items because, like again, if I'm being moved to the harder module, I'm not going to see a bunch of easier items. Whereas with a linear test, I have to do a sample of easy, medium, hard items to capture nuances, the difference between a 13 and a 14 ACT, and also a 35 and 36. So I have to ask enough questions without being adaptive. Science is optional. So you can opt in or opt out. And science is going to be a separate standalone score. So you're going to say, I got a 31 on the ACT and I got a 28 science. It's not part of your composite or your super score going forward. The ACT still is a faster test than the SAT. So compared to the ACT, the SAT gives you 43% more time per question on math and about a third more time per question on verbal. So it's still, although the level of reading on the SAT is meaningfully harder. They operate at about an 11th grade level of reading compared to a 9th grade level of reading on the ACT. This morning, I was talking to a group of college counselors, and one of them, their daughter's a junior, and she was showing, the father, like one of the reading passages for the SAT was really, really dense, complicated language about fruit flies and genetics and inheritance. And even like the dad's like, wow, he's a professor. He's like, this is pretty intense. And so the SAT does give you harder vocabulary and harder passages. And there was like a graph compared to the ACT, which is a lower level. And that's one distinction. So you have more time on the SAT, but with that level of difficulty, some of the kids are going to need that more time. So I mentioned the efficiency gained by going adaptive, that the SAT does everything with 98 items, 8 of which are experimental. But the ACT has 131 without science, and tack on 40, I'm at 171 with science. So it was 171 items versus 98. The SAT is a more efficient test. It's leaner and meaner because it's adaptive, and we can eliminate items which really aren't helpful. If the kid is doing really well, we can eliminate the easy items. If they're struggling, we can knock off the hard items. That's the beauty of adaptive testing. Every section on the SAT, baseline and adaptive, has 2 questions that don't count. They're experimental. They're pre-testing questions for the future. Compared to on the ACT, they have a different format. The SAT now, everything is simply, there's no more long passages. It's simply one little paragraph and then a question. Brand new topic, 1 paragraph, a question. For verbal and math, every question is independent. But English, reading, and science are based on these longer form passages, longer vignettes. So English, you have 5, 10 question passages. Some of them are 5 and 5, but they're long form. Same thing with reading. You have 4 9 question passages. Science, you're going to have about 7 passages. And of these, there's a whole passage of English that's experimental. There's a whole passage of reading is experimental, and a whole passage of science, which means 29 of the items don't count, which is 17% compared to 8 of 98 items, around 10% on the SAT. So you have a lot more items which don't function, but they're doing pre-testing for future assessments. We're looking at globally broadly, the SAT, versus like the new ACT. We recommend strongly that the SAT is digital and adaptive. That's all you have. You have a choice now, paper, ACT, or digital, and we advocate the paper. Some kids are taking it during a school day, and it may be administered by the district or the school, and they have no option. If you have a choice, do paper. We like it better. We have a hard time with the TestNav interface from Pearson's, which is not as good. It's worse design. I got an email today from the ACT that everywhere you go, you can bring your own device, but this wasn't the case on the September test a few weeks ago. So I still don't know, is this universal across the whole country? Some of our kids, they weren't able to bring their own device, and they had to use a school device. And sometimes there were problems with the tablets, the Chromebooks. There were problems with trackpads, and even the screen resolution wasn't perfect, where sometimes the bottom was being cut off of buttons. That wasn't great. So BYOD looks like it's coming, but it may not be universally available. We're still trying to sort out, is that, I saw the email today, but we'll see in October, will it change? A thing I don't like, that the highlights on the Pearson's TestNav, they disappear. From question 2 to question 3, I can highlight, they all go away. which is that's a bad design. Additionally, you have to go up and down, this like 5 or 6 paragraph thing. And on question 7, it says one main point of the highlighted paragraph is that, and you have to scroll around to find it. And so it could be a highlighted sentence, and it should point you right there, but it doesn't. So without, in a digital format, that it's a little bit wonky. The College Board, they did a total redesign. They got rid of their long passages, and they really made a test designed for the computer, designed for a tablet, designed for a Chromebook or a Mac, and it's just more elegant and it's better design. Additionally, the College Board did a licensing deal with Desmos. They provide calculators for about half the kids in the U.S. About over 1.5 million kids each year are using Desmos for physics and chemistry. It's a licensing deal. It's a phenomenal calculator for graphing, really helpful, really versatile. So the College Board locked down that deal. ACT doesn't have that, and their calculator isn't nearly as good or helpful. So that's one area also with College Board's better. When it comes to timing, so the ACT is redesigned, and they gave kids more time per question, but still we're seeing students struggling with English and math. And like math went from 60 questions to 45 questions, but all they did was eliminate the first 15 questions. So on average, the math questions are harder. You're jumping in at question 16, and so there's less of a ramp up to hard content, which means that even though they gave kids more time per question on the math for the ACT, they're not finishing any faster because it's harder content. But the 2 areas where they are finishing faster are reading and science. Because like science, it's not any harder, and they gave kids another 10 minutes. So that's very useful, very helpful, having more time and not any more difficulty. And reading also, more kids are finishing. So that's a benefit. But comparing the 2 assessments, the ACT is by far a speedier test. Even though the level of reading is lower, it's a harder test for speed. Now, the science section, it's optional. And I did the math for an article, and we had about 150 kids taking it, and about a fifth of our kids didn't take the science section. And we're advocating that everyone take it at least 1 time. So you have a science score on your, in case a school requires it, which is going to be pretty rare, but it may happen. And science is mostly reading. And even though there are 8, 9, or 10 outside questions which require some background knowledge, they're not going to require really intense, detailed knowledge from physics or chemistry or bio. It's going to be more, you understand experimental design, you understand sampling error, do you understand measurement error, what's a dependent variable. It's really basic stuff that's not included in the paragraphs, but not deep, detailed knowledge of chemistry or equations or so forth. And when you look at the data, the reason we're not going to have a bunch of colleges requiring science is this slide here, that of the whole data set of 1.4 million kids who took the ACT last year, the average English, math, and reading score was 19.5. If I throw in science, it goes to 19.7. Looking at the 0.6 million kids who took the ACT that went to a 4-year college, the delta is even smaller. You have English, math, and reading. The average score, the composite score, is 22.7. But then with science, it's 22.8. So you're getting 1/10 of a point, which is not meaningful. And there are some rare kids whose science score really deviates from their reading score and math score, but typically these are highly correlated. There's a lot of collinearity where they move together. Kids who are really good at reading tend to do better in science, and vice versa. So you can eliminate science and not really lose anything, which is why many colleges are going to eliminate science. BU is a weird school where they said, hey, we're test optional, but if you send an ACT, you're required to take science. There are really very few schools doing what they're doing. So many schools, they're saying we don't require it, not at all. Harvard, Stanford, Brown, Columbia, Purdue, and several thousand schools haven't taken the position, which means they don't require it. But there are some schools that do require it. There's Georgetown, BU, Pomona. It's recommended for Duke, Michigan State. That's a few schools. But then like Florida used to require it. Now they're not going to use the science section for the Florida Publics, FSU, U of F. And for their scholarship program, the Bright Futures, it was required. And now it's optional. But we still recommend everyone take it 1 time. It's 40 minutes, not the end of the world. And when they give you your scores back, this was the scores back from the September test. So here we have a student who has a composite score of 34. That's the super score we took across the different tests. But you see in math, they got a 32 in December of last year. In science, a 30. English, they got a 36, amazing English score in this September's test. And this current reading, they got a 33. But what they aren't telling you is that science score, that 30, is not factoring into the average. Because if that 30 counted, the composite would be at 33. So they're including it visually in the, in that list of math, science, English reading. They should really separate it out, put it off to the right in different color, because the science has nothing to do with that composite score. So be mindful of that. Now, science is now no longer part of the composite score and will no longer be factored into any super score. Just be aware of that. But even though visually you'd be a little bit confused by that, that's, again, just bad design on the part of the graphic designers over at ACT. They need some work. If a student is a current senior and only took legacy ACTs, the old ones, then their super score will include science. But if I add in one new one enhanced ACT, then they will exclude the science from the super score and the composite scores. That's the rule. Super scoring, the old and the new, this affects some juniors who may have taken both, and definitely some seniors. And there are 8 schools out there who said we're not going to super score the old and the new, the legacy and the enhanced. Harvard, UT Austin, Michigan State, Chapman. But then you have all these schools who say we will super score. That's Princeton, Caltech, Cornell, Dartmouth, Stanford, Penn, BU, Duke. And you have several thousand schools who've taken no position, and the default is they're going to super score across the old and the new. Because why wouldn't they? The tests correlate very highly. Maybe there's a difference of 1 point. If I got a 33 on the new, I may have got a 32 on the old. They're so close. And that was the point of all their qualitative research, showing that these things correlate very highly. And honestly, the ACT is really not a new test by any measure. The material is identical. If I look at, again, like for math, they made it a little bit harder, but they just lopped off the easy questions. They didn't change the math or their measuring. The science and the English and reading is very, very, very similar content. And the red book, which is the official practice guide for the ACT, all they did was modify legacy tests, chopped them up some, and they become the enhanced. And they're telling you that the material hasn't changed. So it's just the timing has changed and the number of items changed, but otherwise the material is the same material. All right, now the overlap on the assessments is still about 80%, hasn't changed. There's so much in common. The math, well, for the SAT, you have a higher level reading, a little bit more advanced, some of the questions, inference questions. ACT, the math is more advanced. You're going to like pre-cal, you have a science section, so harder math on the ACT, harder reading on the SAT. And there are some differences where the ACT measures, it's less algebra. The SAT is about 70% algebra and advanced math. A little bit of geometry and trig on the SAT, but a lot more, double that amount on the ACT. So they're not perfectly lined up in terms of the math. And also the SAT has eliminated so many word problems. It's more straight math. It used to be flipped, but they made that big redesign decision back in 2024. ACT will cover math content you will never see on the SAT, which is more about functions and graphing and algebra and exponents. You're going to have matrix multiplication every now and again, every few tests. You're going to have ellipses, hyperbolas, parabolas every couple tests. You're going to have asymptotes, domains and ranges of functions. So you're going to have harder math that appears intermittently. We just published our book for the ACT, and it was 1,200 pages because there's so much more math on the ACT than will ever appear on the SAT. But it's not on every single test. It kind of appears every couple. But there definitely is a bigger range of content they pull from. So, all right, and for the SAT math, they give you scratch paper, they give you the Desmos calculator, very helpful. You have to learn how to use Desmos if you are going to take the SAT, because you can use it to solve about 2/3 of the problems, and often with massive shortcuts. So Desmos is powerful. You can practice on Desmos.com. You can, like, one fast example, they give you 2 lines, and they ask me what's the value of y? So when I'm looking for the solution to the equation system, I'm trying to see where they intersect. And so I could either solve and back this out and isolate y, or I plug them into Desmos, boom, 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 value of y is 3. So again, it's simply showing you there's one shortcut of 500 shortcuts to help you solve, going from algebra, just doing graphing instead. So Desmos is a graphing powerhouse machine. Now the SAT, it's all short passages, under 150 words, one question, moving on. And occasionally I've seen two very comparison passages, but like 5 sentences apiece, very, very short. ACT, longer form. And then the SAT goes through this standard formula. First, they're doing read comprehension, words and context, text and structure. Then they go to info and ideas, evidence, inference. Then we go to grammar, boundaries, form. Grammar is smaller on the SAT than on the old one. And there's less grammar than on the ACT. And then finally you go to transitions and rhetorical synthesis. So that's the formula and structure for the verbal section. And be mindful, again, I kind of gave you the sense that there's a baseline module for the SAT, then there's adaptive. That looks kind of like this. So in the Blue Book test, you have the smattering, the baseline module, the items are mostly in the middle. I have 10 level 2s, 7 level 3s. If I get more than a third wrong, I'm going easy. And then I skew to the easy questions. I go to 7 level 1s and 9 level 2s. If, however, I get more than 2/3 right, I'm going hard, and it looks more like this. My level 1s aren't 7, I only have 1 level 1, but they really bump up the 3s and the 4s. So the modules definitely feel and look different. And additionally, that every single item on the SAT can have a different weight. There are like 5 different weights, and some questions, like for math, are foundational concepts, and they're going to weigh a lot more than other items. And because of that, every item counts differently. Also on the different modules, they have different weights. And so when they give you your scores back, they don't ever tell you you missed this many, you got this many right. All they give you is these heat maps, because different items have different weights and they don't want to make it confusing. So they just withhold. It's kind of a black box for the College Board. Our practice test is really good. And we have, we give you full feedback, full analysis when you use Applerouth practice tests. But those are pretty handy. When you're practicing for the SAT, there are 7 good tests in the Blue Book. Practice on them, learn Desmos, very helpful. And everyone should take a baseline practice ACT, ideally paper, what you prefer, and then a SAT. It's only a couple hours at each test. You can do it on a weekend or 2 weekends, and then see where you're better. There's no guessing. I just look at the numbers. If you are more than a 70-point difference on the scale of the SAT, let's say I get a 1200 SAT and a 29 ACT, that's like a 1290, I'm going with the ACT. If, however, I get a 1200 SAT and a 27, then I'll ask the kid which one felt better, because there's about 30 points of error on each test on a given day that can move. It's called the standard error measurement. And so, but more than that, if I add up the 2 errors and beyond that threshold, I have an advantage. That's durable, that'll last on any given day, typically. Ideally, your testing plan should have 3 official tests. Some kids are 1 and done, some are 2 and done, but by the 3rd time, most all of our kids have hit their max. And there is super scoring. Again, as I mentioned, like they take that September math score plus the December reading, and they max it together to make my super score. And more schools are doing that. Things that make you better at testing: practice tests. If you practice taking several, I recommend every 6 hours of like working with a tutor or working with a book, do a practice test, spreading it out. When kids who cram it all together don't do as well as those who space it out over time, ideally you have 10 weeks versus like 2 weeks. Kids who start earlier tend to have more time and do better. The more time you put in, the better you do. Having a goal is helpful for motivation, and also having momentum towards the end. Don't do a big summer class in June and then wait until the March test. That's not ideal. You want to take a full timed practice test within a month of taking the official tests, and you want to do some review. So testing plan, pretty simple. We now have, for the first time, there was a September SAT. There are 5 in a row. August, September, October, November, December, SATs 5 months in a row, which is amazing. Because I remember when there was no August SAT, there was no September, there was the big gap between June and October, but the summer tests are great. And now, you have a nice range of 7 ACTs and 8 STs per year, which is great. A lot of options. There are different ways to do it. You can prep in the summer and then do some review, or you can prep in the spring and do summer testing. So you have lots of ways of getting these tests in, and you want to work around your schedule, and don't put the testing and the test prep during your kids' most intense schedule. If they're the lead in the play, or they're varsity, or they're a club athlete traveling around, try to move testing where they're not totally busy with their sport or activity. And super scoring, I mentioned that they're just combining your best scores from different administrations, and that becomes the score they evaluate you with. All right, the ACT will automatically generate a super score for kids. But more and more kids are self-reporting their scores, and only if you're accepted must you submit the official score report and spend the money on that. Now, science is going to stand alone. If you want to include science, you can send the official score report right to a college. And there's a question of, should I send my scores? Well, first thing first, get your baseline scores. Look at, are you close to what they're looking for? And if you're in the upper 50 percentile, my friend Rick, he said, send it. It's going to help you. If you're in the lower 50 percentile, it depends. If you're in the bottom quarter, though, I probably withhold it. Here's the example I give. So the Buffaloes, if I have over 1270, I'm going to send it because they're middle 50. Half of the class who is enrolled got between an 1170 and 1380. So 1270 and above, always send it every time. If I have below an 1170, if I get an 1120, I probably shouldn't send that score because it's not going to be strong. It's a weak score. And I should go on the merits of my academics, unless you're from a first generation in West Virginia, where the average at your high school is a 1050 and you scored an 1150 and it's the best, in that case, okay, they're going to look differently at that school. Looking at the averages, and often schools send their high school profile where they give a range of test scores and things. And so that's meaningful. But if you're from a standard school, that's competitive, it's a feeder school, and your test scores are just relatively weak for your class, I probably would withhold them. The area where it's a little bit trickier is that third quartile, that 1170 to 1260. If I got a 1260, I'm more inclined to send it than if I got an 1170. But also, let's say I'm applying to be an engineer, and I got a 700 on math, but a 550 on verbal. So net, I'm still in the third quartile, but I want to make sure they see my 700, so I would send it, even though I'm in the third quartile, because that math score is top 2%. And then there's also the question of how good are my grades and my scores. Let's say I have a 392 unweighted, almost all A's in high school, and I have a bunch of rigorous classes, dual enrollment classes. I have 12 rigorous classes between APs and dual enrollment, but then I have an 1180. In that case, my academics are so good, my grades, my rigor, I don't want to pollute them with a lower test score. If, however, my grades are more middling, let's say I have a 3.5 unweighted, let's say I have only 4 APs and I got a 1240, well, then I probably send it. So there is some calculus here. You can talk to your high school, your guidance counselors, your college admissions counselors, and get a sense of, would this test score help me here, hurt me here? There's some nuance. But if you're over that halfway mark, you send it. It's very simple, very clear. Okay, so now we're going to take a moment and administer one little poll. Some of you might want help with practice testing. Some of you might, and those are free. We give a free test. We're going to send a poll right now, and just let us know, can we help? And then I'm going to go to my Q&A, and we have 17 minutes left for the Q&A. Again, super quick. If you want any help in any area, please let us know, and then we can reach out. So now I'm going to pivot to question and answers. And let me go ahead and open this up to the Q&A. Here we go. There was a question. Is there anything for February? So there is a February ACT. That's the first one of the year. There's February, then there's April. The first SAT is in March. So you have March SAT, you have March, May, June, August, September, October, November, December. And then the ACTs, they start in February, then April, then you have June, July, then September, October, December. All right, so, but what are your questions? What haven't I answered? I'd love to answer all of your questions. Go ahead and type into the Q&A window anything that I didn't answer. Here you go. When should one start prepping for the exam? Is 10th grade too soon? I mean, ideally, here's my thought. If you're in Algebra 2 as a junior, you don't want to take it until you finish one semester. That would be the earliest test would be the March SAT or the February ACT. If I finish Algebra 2 in 10th grade, then you're good to go at any point after that. Some students are really advanced with math, and they're really advanced also verbally, in which case potentially the end of sophomore year. But because the English, the level of reading on the SAT is 11th grade, they're going to throw Shakespeare in there and Milton, advanced science reading. So, but some kids are that advanced, both verbally and with math, in which case, okay, the very end of sophomore year, for the super, super high flyers. Otherwise, wait until you finish sophomore year. And then as long as you finish Algebra 2, you can do it over the summer. And a lot of our our strongest applicants, they're taking summer prep before they start their junior year. And they're going to lock in an SAT even like in August or in September, and so forth. Is there a correlation between the SAT score and the SAT ACT? Yes. The PSAT and the SAT, they are lined up almost exactly. The only difference is the top of the range, where the PSAT peaks at 1520 and the SAT goes to a 1600. And but otherwise though, they are lined up. So if I get, let's say, a 1250 on the PSAT on that day, I should get a 1250 on the full scale SAT, which means there's no, it's one-to-one. There's a name they use in terms of how they mathematically equated those two, where it's just linearly locked up. So, but again, there's a difference. If I get a 1510 on the PSAT, then I miss one question, then I might get, a 1550 or 60. But that's only the very, very, very top. Otherwise, like 1300, it should be, graphically, linearly, perfectly aligned. And the SAT and the ACT are correlated, so you could go from a PSAT and look at the concordance table for the ACT to see where I'm better. So you can definitely use the PSAT as a proxy for the SAT because they are the same scoring, and that'll help you determine, should I take the SAT or the ACT. So the PSAT is a great proxy. And again, it's the same content, it's the same length, same number of questions. And it's only, they withhold a little bit of the hardest science, and they don't do trig on the PSAT. Otherwise, it's the same test, which didn't used to be the case. All right, other questions. What are other questions that we haven't yet answered? All right. What if my 11th grader is currently in Algebra 2? Should they plan on prep in the summer and test in the fall? All right. Yeah, you're an 11th grader. It's now October. I would say get one semester under your belt of Algebra 2, and then they're good to go. Because there's not that deep, that much content, and we've seen plenty of kids do a semester of Algebra 2 and then do totally fine on these tests mathematically. So I would say do a practice test in, let's say, January, and then you can go ahead and you can prep for there's a March SAT, there's a May, there's a June. Because I don't want them to test in the fall, because here's the thing. You have early deadlines, and most every one of your kids is going to apply early action or early ED somewhere. And those deadlines range between middle of October to 1st of November, typically. And so I want to have testing done for my early application, which means the last test I could possibly take, September is a sure thing, and the October is a maybe. Okay. And so I want to, ideally, you get, you're going to have the June SAT, you're going to have the August and September, but I would recommend starting a little bit earlier, just so there's less pressure, and they're focusing on other things when they come around to being a senior with applications and essays and everything else. So I would say try a practice test of both when they finish up this semester, and then see where they are. Okay. All right. The pre-med students take the SAT or the ACT, either one. You can take, and colleges have no preference. Because again, there are certain parts of the country where everyone takes the SAT. So the ACT originally came from Iowa City, and the SAT was on the coasts. The first offices were in Princeton, in New Jersey, and then over in California, and the Bay Area. And so it's like the coasts have always been heavy SAT, the middle of the country ACT, and still in certain markets we work in, more kids take one or the other. And colleges are indifferent. They're like, as long as you have one, we don't care. Though I'm telling you right now, across the country, we're seeing more kids taking the SAT, which aligns with that early graph. About 2/3 of our students are taking the ST right now. But the ACT, being shorter, science optional, may have a comeback. I think it will, actually. Any other questions? We have another, if you want it, another 10 minutes. If not, we'll wrap it up early. All right. Last question before we get off the train, leave the station. All right, so we're going to have more webinars coming up. Thank you so much for coming out, and a recording will be forthcoming. Everybody have a great night, and thanks for being part of this. All right, take care. Bye-bye.